Hello and welcome back to Instant Insights. At Global Data Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. I'm Carolina Pinto, and today I'm joined by Steve Blitz, Chief US Economist at Global Data's TS Lombard. Steve, how are you?
I am fine. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you for coming back on the podcast.
Oh, always happy to be here.
So we've had quite a few episodes discussing Trump, but he's all over the news, so there's always more to talk about.
Yeah.
In his first month of his second term, the administration has been very busy. A big focus has been on US trade policy and tariffs. We are now expecting new tariffs to come in on March 4th. And while we've had a couple episodes discussing the impacts of the tariffs on the global economy, kind of wanted to get you on the podcast to discuss their impact on the US economy. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. First of all, I think how tariffs look inside the U.S. is very different from how tariffs look like outside the U.S. Okay. So the general sense within the Trump administration is that if you got a 20% tariff across the board. Now, that doesn't mean every country pays 20%, it's just that it all averages out to kind of 20%.
Yeah.
That's the limit where you could go and have essentially a neutral effect on the US economy, right? In
Hmm.
terms of prices paid, right? Because the currency adjusts and that lowers things and all sorts of other stuff. And you bring and you have a minimal effect on consumer prices, but you also have this nice revenue inflow, of about $350 billion a year, right? Which is a critical given what he wants to do with the budget. Now, but let's just roll that back for a quick second to understand where and how they're coming to that perspective. We are, as a nation, we are a net buyer of the world's production, right? So therefore, whatever tariffs other countries put on the U.S. is not going to be as critical to the tariffs the U.S. puts on other countries because on net we buy more than we sell. So that's first off. Second off, the U.S. trade deficit is not the way we learn it in school, which is, we buy Italian suits and Italians buy whatever from the US, right? Most of the US deficit, the lion's share, maybe 75% of the US deficit, is created by US firms purchasing product or inputs that are created outside the US to then either they sell directly into the US or they use those parts and bits to produce a product assembled in the US and then sell to the US
Can
consumer.
you give us
Okay.
an example?
I'll give you two really easy examples. Think of Apple phones or Nike sneakers, right? They're
Hmm.
basically they're produced and assembled. Nike sneakers are made for the most part in Vietnam. All right.
Yeah.
Apple iPhones are made in China. Now, it's true that within those countries, there's a global sourcing of bits and pieces to assemble them, but they're assembled there, imported into the United States, and then sold in the US. Okay. And US consumers buy Nike sneakers because they like Nike sneakers. They're not buying it because they're a Chinese product or a Vietnamese product, right? So this is a very different than, say, the trade deficit in the 1980s when American consumers shifted to purchase foreign products because they were perceived to be better. Toyotas and Nissans and Hondas were considered to be better than US cars. Sony TVs were considered to be better than the US product, and on and on and on. We're in a very different world today. When you think about tariffs, therefore, the tariff is really a tax on the production process of the company
Hmm.
and how much that company wants to, can, or will forward that increased cost into the final price, we don't really know, right?
Hmm.
The obvious guess and the first step is to say 100%. But the truth is, it may or may not be. right? Now, the Trump administration, their motivation is to create enough of a tax, right, where a company now can lower its cost by, in effect, moving that production or that source of that bit
Back to the
from
US.
something back to the US. Exactly. And that's how you use tariffs to create budget revenue in the near term, and then to create a reshoring of productive activity over time. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very different, say, than from a country that depends upon selling its production into the United States, where a tariff now forces it into a currency devaluation that has other offsetting negative impacts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the pressure on the net exporter to the US is very different than the pressure within the United States.
Yeah. Although tariffs are a big policy, they haven't been the only one um, mentioned or enacted by the Trump administration so far. Are any of Trump's other domestic policies gonna also impact both the tariffs and the US economy itself within the next year?
Well, sure. I mean, we're in the process of figuring out a budget, right? And
Mm-hmm.
the problematic aspect of that is that it shifts things around. So in terms of taxes, creating some tax cuts, which are critically important, right? Because the way to look at the tariffs, right, is that if I increase tariffs, and let's just say, for argument's sake, it does end up increasing costs
Yeah.
to the consumer. But if I give them a tax cut at the same time, I net them out to zero,
Mm-hmm.
right? But there's a lot of budget hawks that say, no, 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 you can do that, but you got to cut costs. And the problem with cutting costs is that most of the costs really are in transfer payments, right? I know Musk is making a lot of news, firing government employees and all this waste and fraud and abuse and all this stuff. But understand that non-discretionary, non-defense discretionary spending, right, is 2% of the budget. You've got this performance of, oh, we're cutting this, we're cutting that, we're getting rid of spending, this foreign aid spending, which is few $1 billion. But that's not the problem. But it's performance, right? It's all
Mm-hmm.
performance. So we're in the process now of trying to figure out what to do. And the problem is, it's like lower taxes versus cutting Medicaid. What government wants to do, or Republicans want to do, to be more clear, is cut Medicaid. And they want to create work rules that, oh, you got to work so many hours. They're trying to tighten that up, thinking that a lot of people choose to be poor and sick and live on free health care from the government. And somehow that is something people don't, want to see change. And look, there's a lot of fraud and abuse. There's also a lot of fraud and abuse on the part of providers,
Mm-hmm.
most notably, as it usually occurs with this type of legislation, it focuses on the people getting Medicaid, but it really doesn't focus on the providers in Medicaid who have been known and prosecuted. Including, there was a big case with Rick Scott, the senator from Florida, who was involved in a lawsuit that he built government out of billions in Medicaid.
Mm-hmm. But even these cuts, whether it be the tax cuts or cuts to social security services, from my understanding, they just simply, again, they're performative in certain manners where it won't be enough to close down, or even if there's an attempt to close down that federal deficit, especially with increased border security spending.
Correct. So taxes or government receipts as a percent of GDP since 1965, and it even true if I go back farther in time, is a remarkably consistent 17% of GDP,
Yeah.
17.5%. But the spending, especially since early 2000s, has gone up and is now running at about 24% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
So the real question, if there was an adult in the room in Washington, you would sit there and say, look, here's the deal. Either we end these programs,
Mm-hmm.
right, which nobody wants to do, or we have to be willing as a nation to tax ourselves to pay for them. So the easier narrative that is being sold, that continues to be sold in Washington, is that if I lower taxes, I'm going to increase growth, and that increased growth is going to, in turn, create the revenue going forward to pay for all these forward obligations.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a false narrative. History has proven that that's not true.
How it works, yeah.
Okay, it's not how it works. And the biggest problem is that for the US, the rate of growth, going back to a lot of this stuff was put in initially and not changes of programs have been made since then, back in 1965. Nobody assumed at the time that population would start to slow. And with that, productivity slowed, and more importantly, the natural rate of growth of the economy is slower, right? And on top of that, we've taken a lot of real growth away from the economy, right, in terms of real income growth, by beginning with Reagan as an answer to high inflation, of opening up the world to sell its product into the United States. Right? I mean, we always had an open border, but it opened even that much more so.
Yeah.
So the trade sector of the economy has grown from 10% of GDP to 30% of GDP.
Mm-hmm.
So with that threefold increase, you've also lowered real income growth in the United States, because the middle has been hollowed out. And the true resolution, which is the opposite of what Trump wants to do to fix all this, is you have to increase population. Right? Now, a lot of people have this idea, because you have a lot of Christian nationalist type running around, and J.D. Vance and others. They think, well, the way to grow the population is to encourage families to have a lot more babies. Well, it's a nice idea, I suppose. But forgetting about the politics and the social part of that, it's going to take a long time to get a lot more people. I mean, you got to wait 18 years.
I mean, the easiest way to grow population quickly, I think, is something that Trump himself struggles with: immigration.
Exactly.
You know, we've been seeing a lot of dismantling or attempts to dismantle U.S. federal agencies. Which federal financial institutions have been impacted by this restructuring? Which ones will be impacted, and how does this restructuring impact the ability of these institutions to regulate the U.S. economy?
Wow. It's a hard question to answer, because everything is still up in the air, and we really don't know how much. We see these numbers about people being fired, and then we turn around. I just saw a headline that, they fired all these people, who were doing work on the bird flu, and now they're rushing to hire them back. So there's a lot of this stuff that's going on, and we really don't know how it's going to be settled. I think that from a financial market and a regulatory standpoint, and this goes with or without what Musk and his team are running around doing, is that the White House is taking control of regulatory policy. And they're not, and this has been a conservative issue for a long time. There is some truth in what they're trying and what they want to accomplish, right? So generally, there's been this idea that Congress, president, they sign bills to create some agency or some panel whose job is to oversee this, and usually oversee some regulation. The FCC, the Federal Communications Committee, the Federal Trade Commission, the Fed, and usually these are made up of a mix of Republicans and Democrats. It's a good government thing. It's not about politics. It's supposed to be about what's right for the economy and what's to do. but a lot of conservatives feel that these agencies have become the Environmental Protection Agency mostly, because that's where all the green stuff comes out of, kind of create their own law. And they're creating laws and regulations that are, and that's the fine line between what is within their charter to do and what is law that rightfully should be created by Congress, right? And since they're part of the executive branch, that Trump has the right to say, hey, you can't, I'm going to tell you what you can do. You can't do it just what you want to do anymore. Again, it's performative in the first order. Eventually, there'll be some changes. Let's talk about the Fed, because that's usually what's on everybody's mind anyway. And so what he said is that away from monetary policy, in terms of regulatory policy of the banks and things like that, they can't do anything unless they run it through the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a certain value in having that check on what they do. So there's a reordering going on. The Republican conservative view has always been to let businesses run free, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think you can expect less constraints on mergers and acquisitions, perhaps an easing of capital requirements, especially on banks, getting rid of hamstringing, what's viewed as hamstringing credit card and banking companies in terms of their charges of consumers, which was part of that Consumer Financial Board, which the Republicans have hated. It was created in the wake of 08-09. The general thrust will be of all these changes will be in that direction of making life less regulated for businesses and financial institutions more generally, mm-hmm. lightening up on environmental rules about gas house emissions and all sorts of stuff like that. And so that's kind of where we're rolling, including, vaccines.
Thank you, Steve, for those instant insights. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Always love talking to you.
Same here, and let's do this. Let's do this more often.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening from us at Strategic Intelligence, see you next time.